The soundscape as an aural environment offers an alternative perspective on the landscape and the urbanscape, and even their terminology. The notion of the scape as scenery and terrain is being reframed in a new light by listening's focus on the invisible, the mobile, and the ephemeral. The sonic environment does not present us with a vista, but grants us access to its unseen depth, from where we are urged to reconsider the dynamics and interests that produce the experience and the concept of the landscape and the urban topography in its nominal and normalized shape. The scenery and the terrain provide actuality, but hide more plural possibilities. Listening, we hear the status quo unfolding before our eyes and appreciate the possibility of an alternative perspective, which produces new ideas on how the world could be, how we could name it and talk about it, and how we could live in it as in a possible world. This possible world is not unreal, parallel or trivial, a fanciful fiction with no impact or consequence on how we live in this world. And it is not an essentialist world, opposed to visual possibilities and exclusive of other senses. Instead, a sonic possible world as material and as concept is a portal into the imagination of possibility in a more general sense, granting us not only other auditions, but other vistas and experiences, other points of views and other ideas about how the world might be and how we might live in it as in a multi-sensory sphere. The sonic possible world is a slice of this world that is a real possibility, a concurrent variant, which augments and pluralizes rather than fictionalizes or opposes what seems actual now. In this suggestion, sound becomes a portal, an access point not only to itself, opening experience towards a sonic materiality, but also to the experience of a radical realism, to the idea of the world not as an absolutely real, but as an indexically real. That is to say that the way the world is, or the way we perceive it to be, is one way for a world to be, that is the one way for the world to be does not exclude or impede for the very same world to be very different. In this, I'm following possible world theorist David K. Lewis, whose plural worlds are all as real as our presumed actual world, which is only actual to us because we live in it. I believe with Lewis that actuality is not an absolute but a matter of point of view. This is an internal and invested point of view, since it is the inhabitant for whom the world is an actual possibility, while it remains merely possible for those outside, who in their turn live in an actual and other actual possibility. And if there are many worlds, then every way that a world could possibly be is the way a world is for somebody. Listening, understood as inhabiting, allows for the consideration of reality and meaning from the mirrored position of living in a world. It gives us access to what is there if we look past the object into the complex plurality of its production, and it shows us the world through relationships and processes, reminding us of the ideological and aesthetic conditioning that determines any sense of reality and truth, possibility, and that other worlds are not impossible, but merely unactualized possibilities. Night. I listen in the dark, to the dark, when nothing sounds and everything becomes audible. Shadows move and trick my eye to hear things that might be there but can't be seen. My listening anchors me in the invisible of the night. It intertwines me in its hue, and I oblige, knowing already but forgetting again my surroundings, I imagine them instead. I imagine myself as a shadow among shadows crossing purposelessly at this hour of the day that has no light. My body extends into the dark space that is my extension in its time between what we both are in reality, as idea, and what we are in auditory imagination, formless and without purpose. This purposelessness is the playful agonism of the night. It is the play of things thinging, hissing, murmuring, rumbling, sounding nothing much at all, but very clearly so. Until the eye adjusts and finds an anchorage in objects instead of in their thinging. But the imagination rescues them from their purpose and instead, for now at least, tired, without a form and yet concrete in experience, we remain thinging, as sleep intertwines us properly, until I wake up to the traffic that has chased away the chorus of the birds.
Puis après, la maman a dit au papa, t'as qu'à aller les porter à la forêt pour que le loup les mange. Oui. Et il voulait pas, hein.
Il n'avait jamais été un lieu plus agréable. Les myrtes et les orangers joignaient leurs branches ensemble pour former de longues allées couvertes et des cabinets où le soleil ne pouvait pénétrer. 1000 ruisseaux de fontaines qui coulaient doucement contribuaient à rafraîchir ce beau séjour. Mais ce qui était le plus rare, c'est que tous les animaux y parlaient.
Stream. Christopher wanted to live in a mountain stream in the winter. He wanted to push his fingers into the mud and watch the salmon spawning. He currently lived above a taqueria in Halstead. Sometimes at night he would open his bathroom window and stand in the shower with the nozzle on all the way cold and feel the wind and the water trickling down over him, and look out at the people milling up and down the street and pretend he was a bear. He was going to eat them. The artistic and political consideration of the sonic slice of the landscape and the urban environment is intriguing in what it reveals, not about itself only, and not against the visual, but about the world as a multisensory realm made from the possibility of architectural construction, social interaction, political government, and personal participation. The notion of the slice and slicing calls these possibilities into the expanded depth of geology, rather than describing them within the visual pursuit of geography. As sonic possibilities, the architecture, the social, the political and the personal are not depictions of surfaces, but reveal the invisible mobility beneath, whose chronology is not sequential, but concurrent. Walking through the environment as a quasi-geological mass, listening to changing shapes, architecture, materials, lights and voices, the landscape remains not a terrain or a topography, but becomes a volume, inviting an understanding of space, not as a constructions of walls, roads, trees, hills, contours and surfaces, but as a dimensionality that has a capacity, the capacity of the environment and the capacity of our experience of it. This volume is not a measure of decibels, but the space of the world's material and temporal expansion. It is an invisible volume that, while causally related to its visual construction, materiality and context, nevertheless produces a different sense. The notion of volume, arrived at via sound, provides us with the term and the imagination for the experience of the environment as a mobile and viscous expanse that enables and holds a formless world without visible boundaries. The experience of the volume renders the environment formless but expansive, invisible but felt. It gives it a viscosity within which we move and breathe together, as in an unavoidably connected but plural sphere. Pursuing the notion of the environment as a volume is not an essentialist stance, sound against vision. It brings us not to a pure sonic awareness, but into a multisensorial realm, where as viewer I become increasingly aware how my reading and understanding of the world is not only constructed from a visible context, but is produced also by the circumstance of its experience, imagined as its invisible and formless capacity that gives the environment its expanse and us a share in its ephemeral mass. Sound as concept invites us into the materiality of things, not to deny the visual but to augment how we might see, and it transgresses the boundaries between the object and thing looked at and the space and context of its appreciation, introducing a sense of simultaneity instead of pre-existence, and promoting the reading of experience of things as agitational, interventionist, multisensory and capacious. Sound produces not an object, either artistic or everyday, but invites a generative perception and draws us towards the invisible mobility in between what can be seen, to engage in what is present but remains unspeakable, invisible and without a name, where the world, the environment and its things lose their semiotic function as signs and symbols and become appreciable as materials and textures, as things to be heard and felt in their capacity and ephemeral mass. A sonic sensibility makes this mass accessible and thinkable as the inhabitable volume of the environment. Listening, its experience becomes mobile, textual and narrated, and expands into the capacity of the world. Host. The wind here is devastating, hoarding sand in the sills of a hotel beaten back by shrieks. It brings with it a certain smell, a certain ring. Nobody is here. There is no waiter. Nobody dances, nobody sleeps. Just you and me, lying in the dust of the restaurant, holding ourselves. And out there, the ocean rising and falling, like the skin over our ribs.
was not hissing. It was not noise. It's not like a crackling. Not singing, not even mechanical. There would have to be some new word to describe it. What struck me really was the totality of the experience.
These places hardly exist. I mean, you should not be there. And you are there listening very carefully through the microphone, which is very, very sensitive. And it's quite magical to listen just silence. Obviously, it is not silence when it's amplified. I volunteered to be the one who went to the forest in the cold nights and trying to get some aural sounds. It was kind of an attempt to ask the question if they exist or not. We were aware of people who have associated sounds to the auroras, but we were also aware of scientific difficulties.
The imagination of the environment as a sonic possible world uncovers invisible depths and produces places boundaryless volumes, and eventually leads possibility beyond the heard into the inaudible, that which also sound, but which for physiological, social and political, or ideological reasons and decisions of taste and preference we cannot or do not want to hear. The inaudible is what expands the visible, what questions its boundaries and confirms the inexhaustible nature of sound. It is the critical edge of listening, from where we attempt to recognize the absent, the unsound and the as yet unheard, the imagined and the ignored, to include them within a present possibility. The inaudible is a radical articulation of possibility. It is where the notion of actuality as possibility also admits the possibility of impossibility, and where doubt and astonishment we consider not only what is assumed as known, but where we accept the presence of the unknowable. It is where perception must plunge not only into the possibility of the world, but also into its impossibility, into what might not exist, what is not yet known, to exist, and what goes as yet unnoticed, or what might simply be imagined, but which all nevertheless might turn out to be possible. This leads not only to the suspension of a priori knowledge and thought, but to the rejection of the limits of the knowable and the thinkable, insisting we open ourselves to what appears unknowable and unthinkable and consider what the possible impossible, the inaudible, means, and what it reveals about what we do hear and about what remains unheard. This unknown is the impossible thing of sound, that which we might hear but have no words for, or that which we might not hear because we have no words for it. It is the voice that cannot make itself count, the sound that is excluded from a register of values and validities. The inaudible is the possible impossible of this world. It is a social-political horizon beyond which we pretend not to see anything, even once we start to hear it rumble. The ethics of the inaudible is an ethics of practice, the practice of listening out for what sounds too, but we do not want to hear, in order to grant it access to the sphere of influence. A sonic sensibility and the notion of sonic possibility aims to create a condition of this access to the infrastructure of influence and participation, to legitimize, through practice, the right and the ability to participate and be acknowledged as a participant. Thus, an ethics of sound moralizes access to the infrastructure of participation, not, however, as an access granted to a particular identity, or inversely open to an undifferentiated universality, but as an access into the negotiation of difference. The negotiation of my possible world with your possible world. It promotes the demand to participate and gives the right to participate. And it generates the condition of the right to listen, the right to hear, and the right to be heard. In this sense, sound is a sensible that is not partitioned, divided up between people or used to divide people according to entitlement, inclusion, and exclusion, in chaque rancière sense, but is diffused into every direction, while reciprocally it makes sensible, in my listening, all the variants of this world. Orbits. Shapeless the waves rise towards their elements, where the foam of time swells within the cells. We will not need bridges. In the dream, the bridges move. Our own liquids augment the surfaces of streams, moving into chaos. The cracked soul desert the gleaming body. Absolute non-logic. Proof of the indefinite. Categories of disbelief. Withdrawing fingerprints from the corners of accuracy. Probabilities that groan madly. How can I and you conclude a maze of directions which are impossible to measure? Fabric of the moment. How can I appear in the silence of thunder? How can I exchange my trenches for the speculations of radiance? I sip what remains of chaos. I clothe the texture of the heart, hiding its resemblance to the invisible. I hinder the crushing of time and the tread of distances. I seal off the gleam of mirrors and complete the face of my substitute. Someday, maybe, I will overcome my certainty, where spaces zoom by and time repositions itself.
We operate in the channels created by the flow of capital, goods, and people. These interiors are controlled immune systems in which all see and are seen. They replicate themselves endlessly in order to soothe and pacify us. An interior is constructed to ensure safety from the outside. This is one of its basic functions. We're accustomed to this feeling of security. We're sure we're entitled to it. As individuals, we move through these enclosed spaces freely, which in turn move with us. But these spaces don't permit mass movement, which could be construed as revolution. Revolution destroys the illusion of interior. The one looking out constructs the view as she would like to experience it from the interior. But those on the other side don't have this luxury to frame and construct the view. This has been the role of architecture in enclosing space, to construct a view of the world outside as you would want to experience it from within. And knowing that means finding a way to resist it. Borders are made silently, often without anybody realizing. They emerge with technology that is not immediately physical, technologies of surveillance, for example, technology that we're either not aware of or become easily accustomed to. From inside, the borders, the limits of this vast interior have become almost invisible. We can no longer see them. But the interior can only exist by exclusion. When the interior comes under pressure from those it excludes, its limits become instantly visible. Then they have an overwhelming physical presence. The limits are violent in their stasis. But sound can travel where the body can't. The radio spectrum, for example, is a landscape unto itself, carved into territories of military, state, and corporate control. Conventions govern what parts of the spectrum can be used by whom, a kind of aural border control. But radio doesn't obey sovereign borders. Its reach depends on other factors: weather, topography, the strength and location of transmitter and receiver. Radio's borders are shaky and moving. They can expand and contract, and they're difficult to map.
The line between what is listened to and what is heard can get precariously slim. The inaudible is not the dialectical opposite of the heard, but is the extension of its audibility, and it ultimately extends the visibility of the visual also. It is anti-semantic, against the descriptive reference to structure, things and beings, but invites the extension of what can be inhabited as semantic material, sensorial, plural, and inexplicable. Listening, we experience the possible slices of this world, what might be and what else there is, behind and beyond the facade of a visual reality that trades in absolutes and certainties, and produces the neoliberal interest of consensus on homogeneity, constructing a realism which, in Rancière's terms, is the absorption of all reality and all truth in the category of the only thing possible. This reality as the only thing possible is not a sonic possibility which is part of and opens up towards all the variants of this world. Instead, it is a tautological possibility as legitimacy of the absolute, where those that have no part have even lost the right to appear as not counted. Rancière explains the absolute possible reality of a current political age as a community that is reduced to the sum of its parts, where singular voices are made speechless in a consensual amalgamation, where they have lost the power to interrupt and the opportunity to be interrupted, and where the noise that might pluralize reality has been muted. This tautological reality does not arise from the engagement in the sensible, in the world as a sonic possible world, but from the ideology of its distribution as an undifferentiated flow that undifferentiates each of us in the mirror of its visual representation. And this visual representation is an inscription in its image that prevents the inscription of anything else. By contrast, sound's truth and reality is plural, and it is unseen. Its necessity is determined in darkness, not on the surface of the visible world, but in its depth. Its flow is not homogeneous and unidirectional, but ambiguous and unpredictable. It produces a fluid environment, constantly revitalizing its context or even denying it, and beckoning us in to generate it for ourselves from its unreliable formlessness and noisy shape. Thus it does not offer an absolute but demands participation, which disrupts the appearance of consensus and makes us see the rationale of objective, of totality, while challenging its intolerance. For Etienne Balibar, the cornerstone of political activity is the tension of equilibrity, the pull between freedom and equality, which is a seat of conflict that enables and calls for participation, and which thus represents the political as the possibility of politics, where rupture happens and transformation can occur, where the excluded can find a voice and make themselves count, and where inclusion can become pluralized. The political possibility of sound is practiced in ephemeral volumes and invisible zones that defy a visual logic and linguistic strategies of consensus and exclusion. The invisible volumes of a sonic environment hold the political capacity of sound to rethink the lines that we might see, creating overlaps and ambiguity, and expanding the necessity of shared contexts through the capacious and boundaryless spheres of sound within which rupture happens and transformation can occur. The sonic possible world is a portal into the political imagination of the audible and the inaudible. It makes accessible the volume of the environment as the political capacity of this world. The politics of this sonic engagement is the politics of the invisible. It is not collapsed into the totality of the image, and neither does it fulfill pre-existing normative codes, but responds to the demand of the dark, when we have lost our anchorage in visual things and rules and are forced to suspend our habits and values, to listen, in order to see the complex plurality of the real as simultaneous possibilities that include also impossibilities, that which has no part in a singular actuality. And it makes us reconsider the part we play ourselves. Pulling my suitcase over the vertical gaps between the large slabs of paving stone in Berlin sounds the rhythm of my transient presence, self-consciously reverberating through the seeming silence of a more permanent inhabiting. I play to you 30 Minutes of Listening by Mark Peter Wright. And I read to you from my collection Sound Words. I played Francis Domon's Les Enchantements de l'Imagination, and I read a poem by Russ Woods called Stream. I read another poem by Sarah Jackson called Host, and I played All Depends on the Sun by Sylvia Ploner and Nicolas Perret. I read to you a poem called Orbits by Aisha Arnout, and I read to you another bit of the collection of blog words from Sound Words. Thank you.